Well, it's wonderful to see so many friendly faces in the audience. But for those of you that I don't know, I'm Alex Sinclair, and I'm a clinician scientist and neurology consultant. And my team focuses on research in raised intracranial pressure, trying to understand why it occurs and how we treat it. For my colleagues over from the hospital, you're well aware of the sheer numbers of patients that we see in the busy NHS. But this also provides a unique opportunity for us that we sometimes forget. That density of patients gives us a unique insight into the disease pathophysiology and expertise into disease area. And for our group, that's really been expertise in raised intracranial pressure. And we've coupled that clinical expertise with our discovery science over at the University of Birmingham. And for us, our more recent work has really started to look at therapeutic options to reduce intracranial pressure. And we've identified a novel drug target which will help to reduce intracranial pressure. And it's really with this in mind that we've begun our conversations with the NASA team, because they also have, the astronauts are having difficulty with raised intracranial pressure. But I wanted to add a little bit more background as to why we've all come to be here today. And actually this comes from an email a couple of months ago. So an email came to my inbox out of the blue, and somewhere within the subject matter was the word NASA. And I thought, well, that's got to be spam, junk mail, and phishing. So I took that email and I didn't open it, and I put it straight in my spam folder, and there it sat for a couple of days. But then I became curious, and I went back and I looked at that email, and I opened it and replied, and so began our conversations with Dr. Polk. And I have to say, we're absolutely delighted at the University of Birmingham to welcome Dr. Polk and his team with us today. We've had a delightful morning of conversations, and I'd like to introduce some of his team. So we have Terence Tadeo, who's the Chief Medical Officer of Johnson Space Center. We have Mike Barrett, a physician, an astronaut, who's been out on 2 spacewalks and been giving us some fascinating insights this morning on what that's about. We have Victor Schneider from the NASA Human Research Program. We have John Allen, an audiologist, and from the Human Exploration Office. Thank you. And of course, Dr. Polk, the Chief Medical Officer of NASA. So I reflect that as a species, we're really compelled to advance and go beyond the boundaries of our normal existence on Earth. And this opportunity to talk and to discuss our knowledge of terrestrial raised intracranial pressure with the NASA team has been an absolute pleasure. And if we can use any of our conversations to help in any way, that's just going to be a real privilege. So thank you for joining us today. And without any further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Dr. Polk, who's going to be giving us his talk on Frontier's Edge, Taking Medicine Beyond Earth.
Thanks, Dr. Sinclair. I'm going to talk fairly rapidly at a very high-speed pass over a lot of what we see in human spaceflight, because this is really several semesters worth of material that we could cram into a very short time. But I also want to leave time for my colleagues to be up here for question and answer as well. So I will tell you, from my perspective, I really, and same with the team, we really enjoyed the conversation so far this morning with Dr. Sinclair and her team. But to Alex, I'll tell you, it's not the first time that I've been considered spam. This is an exciting time for us. I first have to have the disclaimer, as they always do whenever you do a medical lecture. They say, is there anything that you're going to present that's off-label use? Everything I'm going to present is off-label use, because there is no label that says for use in human spaceflight. Let's see, there we go. This is part of what we do. Obviously, this is probably the first space medicine physician you all were exposed to. We take care of the astronaut crews to make sure they are healthy pre-flight and in-flight and post-flight. We actually see the astronauts until they die, as far as a lifetime surveillance of the astronaut health. Because the space environment is so hazardous with radiation exposure and in the microgravity for long exposures now on the International Space Station and elsewhere, we follow those astronauts to make sure that there's not a consequence of that space flight that we need to be aware of, and to keep them healthy as best as possible. This is the other part of what we do, is kind of the mad scientist aspect, and one of the reasons we're meeting with Dr. Sinclair and her team is because a lot of what we are discovering in human spaceflight is brand new in physiology. In fact, we were talking last night at dinner that it would be great to take one of the physiology textbooks that you all are using in medical school, and on almost every paragraph we could write something where it changes in human spaceflight. And the International Space Station has been especially important for us because we've learned a whole host of new lessons on space physiology that we did not know earlier in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs as well. This is part of what surgeons do. In addition to following the crew, Dr. Taddeo looks very young in that picture, by the way. We also have to make sure that the medical procedures that we do in flight, something as simple as eye drops, for example. Eye drops don't drop in space. And so you can't say, put 2 drops in your eye. Sometimes you have to form the ball and using the surface tension to allow the medication to stick to the eye. And of course, following the crews and mission control. This is probably the tipping point for space, and especially human spaceflight right now. There are more people going to space and more vehicles launching to space with people on them than ever in history. And this is one such vehicle. This is Virgin Galactic's vehicle, which went above the 50-mile mark, which is considered the terminator or termination line for our atmosphere, and then going into space. And they went in December and got their space wings. Their pilots got their space wings in February by the Federal Aviation Administration, and they took a passenger, one of their trainers, in March. And they will be taking passengers up into suborbital spaceflight. That's where, not going around the Earth, but up into the space atmosphere and then coming down. So if you've got $250,000 lying around and you'd like to go on Virgin Galactic, that opportunity is coming very rapidly. Blue Origin is another one. This is Jeff Bezos. Most of you, if any of you have bought anything off of Amazon.com, you've probably contributed to the space program and didn't know it. Jeff Bezos is the CEO of Blue Origin, and this is his vehicle. And their capsule has gone through a multitude of tests over in West Texas, and they will be ready to fly individuals within the next year to year and a half as well. This person probably needs no introduction. Elon Musk, he's a great stage master, but we've had a great working relationship with Elon. SpaceX is building one of our capsules for us to ferry our astronaut crews to the International Space Station. Boeing is the other vehicle that we are working on. This is another capsule and another vendor that is also building a capsule for us to send astronauts to the space station. Sierra Nevada is another vehicle that is delivering cargo, but also has the capability, if they were so inclined, to fly people. It's more like a plane type winged vehicle versus a capsule, but another contract that it will be delivering cargo to the International Space Station. There are modules other than the ones that we have built that will be going up into space. This is Bigelow Aerospace. It has an inflatable module that can attach to a space station, or it could be an independent space station at some point in time. You might actually, in your lifetime, be going to the Marriott Space Station at some point. I'm hoping they give a lot of points for that. This is our current vehicle, obviously the International Space Station. This is one where we have really learned a great deal about the space environment and space physiology from 250 nautical miles above the Earth, 17,500 miles per hour, by the way. 26 countries, research from 103 different countries, 19 years and counting. And I'll tell you, at NASA, we don't consider this a U.S. vehicle. This is an international vehicle, and we work diligently with our international partners on this vehicle and all the research upon it. We do more than just human missions. In case you haven't realized it, but Mars right now is the only planet solely inhabited by robots. So technically, when we go to Mars, it'll be humans invading a planet solely populated by robots. We also do a lot of telescope missions. Kepler just retired this last year, one of our planet hunters that has found planets outside our solar system, and especially planets in what we call the Goldilocks zone. That's the zone between its sun that allows it to potentially have an atmosphere and water. And there were far more planets than we realized in the Goldilocks zone, and the number just kept growing. Spitzer and Hubble. Hubble probably needs no introduction because of all the beautiful pictures that come back from Hubble discovering different areas of the galaxies in multiple different galaxies, not just ours. James Webb will be our telescope that will launch within the next 1.5 to 2 years that will really expand upon that knowledge greatly from a telescope standpoint. But the human response to spaceflight is what I'm most interested in as the Chief Medical Officer, and obviously from the astronaut perspective as well. And there are a multitude of changes in almost every system that occurs in human spaceflight. We learned a lot in the Space Shuttle program, but those missions were about 14 days in duration versus the 6 months to 1 year missions that we've had on the International Space Station. One of the first things that we learned in spaceflight was space adaptation syndrome. What happens is when after 8 minutes of sheer terror, it's not sheer terror, but certainly a very interesting ride up into space, and you reach microgravity, you have that weightlessness effect. And think about it, all the signals your brain gets to tell you where you are in space right now. Just standing on stage right now, I've got the pressure on my balls of my feet that tell me if I'm leaning forward or back. I have what's called the Golgi tendon apparatus in my tendons that tell me if my tendons are on a stretch or if they're relaxed. I have my semicircular canals telling me if I'm leaning left or right, and I have my visual cortex telling me if I'm even with the horizon. All of those things in an instant when you get to microgravity lie to you. Your partner might be upside down, your semicircular canals are no longer in balance, you don't have any stretch on the Golgi tendon apparatus, and you have no pressure on the balls of your feet or your rear end. And so your brain goes through all of these systems, nope, 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 nope. And part of the problem with that biofeedback is when your brain has all those error and fault nodes, it says, I don't know what just happened, but I'm going to throw up. And so about 78% of the astronauts get either a stomach awareness, but some might have even frank emesis, but we've learned how to treat that. It goes away very quickly, and for the most part within a day or so. But that for the longest time during the space shuttle missions, that's why we didn't dock immediately or do critical actions like a spacewalk as soon as we got to space, because we didn't want somebody who was nauseated going out and doing a spacewalk, or somebody trying to do a laser range finding and docking with the space station at 17,500 miles an hour, where there's very little room for error, saying, yeah, that's not a good time to do that. Cardiovascular effects, you'll notice the puffiness of the face there when you have all this fluid that's normally down in your lower extremities and mostly in your venous capacitance. About 70% of your blood is in your venous capacitance. All of that moving now suddenly northward into the head and thorax. And so you start to see a lot of different changes here. Let me go back 1 second. How your body determines your blood volume, you've got your pressure sensors in your carotid and in your right heart. But now, because of all that fluid and the Starling curve, your carotid bodies think that you have too much fluid, as does your right ventricle, and you start to decrease the amount of fluid because it thinks you're in fluid overload. It does not realize that all this fluid has moved north. Erythropoietin and the receptors to produce new blood are usually in the afferents of the kidney, and that has gotten more blood. And so it's a downregulation of some of those things because the body perceives that it now has a fluid overload. And when we come back on landing, this is one of the things that we see. The red line is long duration spaceflight. The black line were shuttle missions. You can see that the heart rates go up and they become orthostatic, especially on standing. And that's because they try to get rid of that fluid and the body tries to downregulate and get rid of that fluid. So they're actually behind on plasma volume when they land. In fact, on long duration spaceflight missions, they're about 1.5 liters, almost 2 liters behind on plasma volume because the body has tried to reach homeostasis and self-regulate again. And that fluid distribution shift, you can start to see that. You have this fluid down here in the lower extremities, and it shifts up into here. You try to get rid of that fluid, and then when you come back to Earth, all that fluid flows down into your lower extremities again, and that's why you can become orthostatic. If you've ever seen the astronauts when they land in Kazakhstan on the Russian Soyuz, the Russians put them in a reclining chair when they first get out. Now, I'll tell you a secret that we did in the Space Shuttle program, and you must promise never to tell anyone, all right? This is, since this lecture is taped. But we used to have our flight surgeons in blue flight suits whenever we went and recovered the shuttle crew. And the reason that we did that were twofold. One was so that the physicians could stand next to the astronaut if they were a little wobbly and make sure that nobody fell. But also in case we had an astronaut or two that needed IV fluids from their orthostasis, they could be behind we had a trailer type thing that the astronauts would evacuate into, and we could give them IV fluids, but the press would never be aware because there's still 7 or 8 or 9 people in blue flight suits wandering around the space shuttle saying, yes, look at those tiles, yes. On 2 of those were flight surgeons, but the press was not aware of that at all, so don't tell on us. In the process, one of the things that we have found for ISS was, as Dr. Sinclair mentioned, we started to stumble across the fact that we were getting vision changes. And the astronauts were able to assess that and get some fundoscopy images, but then as we noticed this to become a real entity, we got more and more hardware on orbit. But this is some of the things that we have seen, and the prime reason that we're here talking to Dr. Sinclair and her group is you start to see, normally you have a nice round eyeball, and suddenly it was a little flat, such that if you put the astronaut's eyeball on a table, it wouldn't roll. Now, we don't put astronauts' eyeballs on tables, by the way, but cotton wool spots, which indicate protein fluid or hemorrhage in the back, the scotoma, widening of the optic nerve, and what are called choroidal folds, which are think about it like wrinkles in the carpet, if you will, in the background. There are actually wrinkles in the choroid due to fluid and swelling in the back of the eye. And this was due to this fluid shift and these fluids sequestering into those tissues. And that unfortunately causes a change in vision. If you think about, let me go back one second. If you think about light coming into the eye and focusing on the back of the retina, suddenly I've moved the view screen up a little bit because we've changed the distance and the focal length, and so that changed the vision as well. And this relates to a lot of what we call the Monroe-Kelling doctrine. Your brain and your skull is kind of an immovable object, and if I try to put 2 liters of fluid in a 1.5 liter bucket, it doesn't go very well. And so something's got to give in that respect. And the thing that we worry about with raised intracranial pressure is, of course, the cerebral perfusion pressure, the ability to perfuse and make sure that the arteries are delivering enough blood to the tissues and not having to compete with intracranial pressure for that. And this is the other thing that we started to see. If this is pre-flight and this is post-flight, these are the sulci, which is the spaces between the brain tissue and, of course, the gyri. And you'll notice that this one is thinner post-flight, and that means that this has a little bit of cerebral edema. Not a lot, but a little bit. And those are, of course, concerning for us. We don't want astronauts to have optic nerve edema and cerebral edema and have long-term consequence or issues from those. And it does actually impact when we write requirements and standards. Part of our job as the technical authority for Dr. Taddeo and I is we develop the requirements and standards for spacecraft, which seems a little odd for physicians to be doing that. But if you think about the physiologic changes, if you were going to write a requirement, what font and what size lettering would the astronauts need to see for a panel, for an engineer, for example? And the lesson is, it depends. This is what they can see when they launch, and this is what they can see when they land because of the change and the optic nerve and the vision. And so you can see this one says switch 1, switch 2, switch 3, and I'm not really sure what that says. And so that's kind of a hazardous thing. And think about when you go to Mars, that's a 6 to 9 month trip to Mars. And so if they have a vision change from the time that they launch to the time that they're now landing on Mars, we're going to land on Mars for the first time, and it's going to be a critical landing, and nothing should go wrong. And you'd hate to have the commander say, well, I think that says fire the retro rockets. So those are things that we worry about. Neurovestibular-wise, when the astronauts are on orbit for a length of time, there's a dyssynchrony in neurovestibular inputs. Think about just running on a treadmill and all the things that you have to do to make sure that you are balanced on a treadmill. When the astronauts are running on a treadmill, they're running on a treadmill that's actually on an isolation bag, if you will, that's wobbly. And half the time, and Mike, correct me, I think your treadmill's on the wall. You're actually... Yeah, it's a matter of perception. There is no up, down, or sideways on the space station, and so you're literally strapping yourself so that you don't float off the treadmill and running on it. And so you're not getting that same biofeedback that you do to keep yourself upright like you do on riding a bike or running on a treadmill on the ground. The consequence of that, and one of the things that we see is the astronauts have saccades. Saccades is a smooth pursuit of your eye tracking, and this is L-10 is launch minus 10 days, i.e. 10 days before launch, and R plus 0 is after they land. And what we were seeing was that normally you have a nice, smooth visual scan as you move your eyes from left to right. And we were seeing what are called saccades, moving back and forth in a more jerky position. And that's because of the dyssynchrony in neurovestibular inputs that the astronauts have been exposed to. Let's see. Musculoskeletal. You get taller in space. That's the only reason I would want to go to space, being on the slightly stature diminished slide of the equation. But you can have an increase in your height between 2 and 6 centimeters, and that causes some stretch in the ligaments. Think about your discs. Your discs are mostly a gelatinous material as well as water. And when they are offloaded, they can increase in size as well. Your muscle changes. You can actually have a change in muscle morphology and an increase in the number of type 2 fast twitch fibers, especially in the lower extremities, because you're not using those to run and walk, except for the treadmill exercise that they're doing, but you're not using it for postural changes. You have bone changes, and the interesting part about bone changes, and Dr. Snyder's an expert in this, is that we start to lose the cortical bone, or I'm sorry, the trabecular bone, and it actually comes back on the cortical bone side. So think of the trabecular bone as the matrix or to add strength. And at one point in time, they were losing between 1% and 2% of their bone per month, and that's from Wolff's Law. Wolff's Law states that bones grow according to the pressures placed upon it. And so if you're not placing the pressure through the bones, you're starting to lose bone. And that calcium has to go somewhere. It goes through the kidneys, and so it's an increased risk for kidney stone. But when the bone comes back, it actually comes back onto the cortical side, on the outside cortical side of the bone. So even though the density comes back, the strength doesn't necessarily come back 100% as far as we know. And so those are things that we're looking at from a long-term standpoint as well in the astronauts. And this is kind of an example of looking at the normal bone versus the osteoporotic bone and the loss of that trabecular structure. Immune system, there's a depression of lymphocyte function effects in at least 50% of the space crews. And by the way, do you know where our immune fluorescence that we use was developed, that we use for our immune studies? University of Birmingham. Little place outside London, don't know if you've heard of it. The immune system, the immune function can also be changed. Part of that can be, what the absorption of lymphocytes back into the spleen with the fluid shift, but also radiation can cause some changes in the immune function as well. A mild reduction in circulating red cell mass, but again, that's probably due to that fluid shift and causing a downregulation of erythropoietin. And so those are the things that we start to think about. Behavioral and psychosocial, this is always an interesting aspect, and Mike can speak to this when we're talking afterwards. But the crew's exposed to a fair amount of noise. It's about 80 to 90 decibels on the space station in the background. You've got mission control constantly calling you up with orders and trying to follow a protocol. It's an enclosed environment. There's probably some noxious stimuli on occasion. There's other different things that they have to endure. Changes in sleep habits, not really a diurnal variation because they have a sunrise and sunset, how many times per day? 17? 16 times per day. And so that can all change in the psychosocial dynamic. Plus, being trapped in a capsule with somebody for 6 months, if that person has an annoying habit, that can be an issue. And so those are the things that we look at. Now, they do have contact with the family with what we call an internet protocol phone, but they don't have physical contact with their family. And now, one of the things that we found with this IP phone, we were patting ourselves on the back. The astronauts can actually call you, and it ends up being a 281 area code. It looks like they're calling you from Houston. And they bounce it off a satellite, and they can call you on their phone. And they can call and talk to family at the end of the day, but their day has been packed. So if you can imagine having a very long day of procedures and everything else. One of the issues that occurred that we didn't really plan on is we thought we were being really smart. We thought, wow, they're going to be able to talk to their family each night. They're going to be great. Except sometimes the problems from Earth make their way onto the space station. Like, I thought you were going to call the roofer before you left. Guess what, mister? The next time that passes around, you're calling the roofer. Probably one of the biggest threats we have in space is a geomagnetosphere and radiation. You know, the Earth is a very protective atmosphere for radiation. And then once you get outside the bounds of Earth, through the Van Allen belts and then into deep space, radiation is something that we worry about a great deal. And there are several different types of radiation. There's the solar radiation. Think of it as sunspot or coronal radiation. And think of those more like a shotgun. Lots of little pellets, slightly lower energy, things that we can block if we have enough hydrogen behind water bags or lead or ceramics. We can block a lot of those. But they can cause, especially in a large exposure, acute radiation sickness if there was such a large exposure. And so on occasion when we have sunspots or coronal flare-ups of the sun, the astronauts might take safe refuge. And the Earth, there is an area called the South Atlantic Anomaly right off the coast of South America that has an increase in radiation, mostly because if you think about the Earth and its magnetic poles, they're not exactly north and south. The Earth actually wobbles through space a little bit and how it goes through there. And then there's what we call galactic cosmic radiation. Those are particles that come from outside our solar system, in fact, probably outside our galaxy in some aspects, and they are very high energy particles, and they will go through anything. And so think of that more like a high-powered sniper rifle. It's not going, hydrogen and the lead and ceramics aren't horribly useful in that respect. And in fact, you can get what's called spalling, where it can slam into the molecule of aluminum of the spacecraft, and now you have a high-energized aluminum particle coming off and smacking into the astronaut. And those are more of a worry for cancer risks, and so that's what we look for there. And this is just showing you what can happen when one of those smacks through in the DNA. And we don't want to have downstream impacts and mutations in the cell line. And that's one of the reasons we do lifetime surveillance of the astronauts. That was very important in Scott Kelly's mission, the one-year mission. And if you saw the data on that, there was a change. I had to laugh. The press said 8.7% of Scott Kelly's DNA changed. Well, if 8.7% of his DNA actually changed, Scott would not be human. There would be a... What really occurred was 8.7% of the DNA expression changed. And you can change your DNA expression. If you don't exercise most of your life and you have a horrible diet and suddenly you find religion tomorrow and you decide you're going to start running and have a great diet, you're going to turn certain genes on and certain genes off. And that's what we found, is that there were genetic expression changes that were fairly long-term. And longer lasting in Scott than we anticipated. The one thing that was very surprising is we thought that when he got to space that the telomeres were going to get shorter, and actually they got longer in space. And so we had to go rewrite all the textbooks for that, because there were a lot of changes there that occurred. Exercise countermeasures. This is an ergometer bike that the astronauts will use, and they will do that exercise 1 hour per day for aerobic side. As Mike mentioned, there is no technically up, down, or sideways, so I didn't make an error in putting the astronaut upside down on this slide. It has a resistive exercise cam, so when we talk about lifting weights, well, technically you're in the weightlessness of microgravity, but what they're doing is doing resistive exercise to put stress through the bones and through the spine to prevent that bone loss. Cardiovascular-wise, obviously, we might do fluid loading before the crew comes home. There's lower body negative pressure. We've looked at that to take all of that fluid that's up in the head and thorax and move that down to the lower extremities. G-suits and liquid cooling garments for when the crew is coming back on the space shuttle. They may need those again from the lunar missions. We'll have to look. Exercise, medication, all act as countermeasures that we looked at. And then post-flight, rehabbing the astronauts and getting them back to normal, if you will. They're not allowed to drive when they first get back because their neurovestibular system is messed up. And it takes a while before they don't feel like they're going to fall, or that feeling like they're falling out of bed sometimes. And then we've had some astronauts that said, for 6 months, they took a drink and they set the glass there and it stayed right there. And one of the astronauts took a drink and put the glass out there in the kitchen and it didn't stay there anymore. So those are things that we think about. But this is where we're heading back to. This was 50 years ago, and I love this picture because of its desolation and the height of exploration all in one photo. But why go back to the moon? We've already been there, so why go back? Well, there's a whole host of reasons to go. One, we don't have a lot of science that we've done on the moon yet. We did very short duration missions on the moon, and there's a lot of science yet to be done on the moon. We've found a fair amount of water in the poles, in the craters in the poles, and so going back to the poles is one of our biggest areas that we want to go back to. And that program is now called the Artemis program. Artemis was the sister of Apollo. And so one of the goals is to put the first woman on the moon. So, anybody want to go? That's one of the goals for this. And so it's the twin sister of Apollo. And obviously, one of the things to go back to the moon for is the moon is not that far away. And so if you're going to use a test bed and start testing things that you're going to do on Mars, which is far away, this is a good place to go do that. And phase one of the Artemis program is to land humans back on the moon by 2024. And so we will have a few missions, one sending the spacecraft up into orbit to test a spacecraft, then putting humans on it and sending it around the moon, and then including the first high electric power system for what we call the Gateway module, and the first pressurized crew module delivered to Gateway, and then putting the lander and the capsule vehicle together. And then that vehicle will go around the moon, and then the astronauts will detach with the lander and go land on the moon, come back to that vehicle, and back and forth. Now, why not just land and do a base? People say, well, how can I do a lunar base? Because there are a lot of different areas on the moon that are scientifically interesting. And so it's better to have our base, if you will, in space, and then have the lander go to multiple different areas on the vehicle. This is the rocket that we're working on to take us there. This is the SLS, the Space Launch System rocket. More powerful than the Apollo rocket, the Saturn V. It's huge, a massive rocket. But if you think about, it's 17,500 miles an hour to get orbital velocity around the Earth. It'll be 25,000 miles per hour to go around the moon. And so that's why we need a much more powerful rocket for that. And then we're using multiple parallel paths. We're actually going to have the lander be a commercial lander. We're going to put out a contract and have somebody compete for that. It could be Blue Origin, it could be SpaceX, it could be Boeing, it could be Lockheed. And there may, depending on how nice Congress is to us on the budget, can we delete that out of the video? No. We may have 2 landers, which would be ideal because that gives us multiple opportunities to go to the moon. And this is what that manifest looks like, with multiple different vehicles launching over the next several years, including robotic vehicles to explore the moon, and then putting that vehicle that will go around the moon as well as the landers. And this is what we work towards. And so if you think about all the vehicles that we're working on today, Dr. Taddeo and I do the requirements and a lot of the technical oversight for SpaceX and Boeing and the Orion capsule and SLS and Gateway and the International Space Station and our own capsule and the landers and 2 X-planes. You start to see that we have 9 vehicles in development versus 3 vehicles in development in Apollo. We are 3 times busier than we were in Apollo. but Apollo had 10 times the amount of budget that we have today. This is what that one vehicle that will go around the moon will look like, which we call the gateway. And then the lander would be attached here, the capsule would attach here, and this would be the habitat. And that will go around the moon and allow us to detach and then send rovers as well as astronauts to the moon and do a lot of science to try to get, again, looking at the proving ground for how we would do Mars. And I think, you got to remember, Mars, it's going to be 6 to 9 months to get there. Mars and Earth don't line up the same, and so you will be on the surface of Mars 18 months before the two planets line up again, before you can have your 6 to 8 month journey or 6 to 9 month journey home. That's 3 years away from Earth. And then phase 2, we'll be using a lot of those to get a sustainability on the moon, and then onward to Mars, to replicate those systems and see what different technologies we'll need, including medical technologies that we'll need. Now, question for you, what is that? Does anybody know what that is? And this always comes to the question, people say, well, why are we spending all this money on spaceflight? Why don't we spend it on Earth, on medicine? Well, those aren't distinct, separate things. This is a space shuttle main engine. And if I told you that the space shuttle main engine was one of the greatest contributions to end-stage heart failure, you probably wouldn't believe me. But Dr. DeBakey, who was working on the left ventricular assist device, which is a device that helps pump blood and acts as a bridge to transplant in patients that are in end-stage heart failure, was having a problem with the impeller. He couldn't get the impeller right. The impeller, unlike a propeller, an impeller starts to swirl fluid so it stacks on itself like a slinky and allows it to push the fluid forward. And he couldn't get it right because it was causing lysis of the red blood cells and it was causing turbulent flow with clots. And he thought, who else uses an impeller? And he was watching a space shuttle launch. And he said, space shuttle's going up this way, the fuel's got to be going that way. They've got to have some kind of pump to push that fuel up against that force. I bet they have a pretty good impeller. And so he came down to the Johnson Space Center and worked with them to see if they could help on the design and engineering of his impeller, and that is it. And that is essentially a much, much, much miniaturized version of the same design of the impeller in the Space Shuttle main engine, now applied to a left ventricular assist device. So those are things that help medicine that you wouldn't think of as a medical technology. This is Robonaut 2, and then the astronauts. Now, if you're scared of robots, the hard part is I can't help you. We're building a lot of robots. But you'll notice the Robonaut 2 has a hand that is very similar to the astronauts. Now, you would think that we did that on purpose, and that was because we were trying to make it very human-like. It's actually because we're a cheap government agency with a very limited budget, and because we couldn't afford two different tools for the robot and tools for the astronaut. We had to have them be able to use the same tools. But the work on the haptics, on touch and fine motor that we worked on for that robot, and GM as well, translates into amputees and has translated a great deal into the prosthetic science world to allow a greater prosthetics and fine motor coordination, and including being able to change what that hand does with an app on your iPhone, which is pretty impressive. Now, if you're really scared of robots, look away. This is Valkyrie. Valkyrie actually can walk and talk, and the idea eventually will be to have robots that will assist the astronauts on surfaces like Mars. Valkyrie would probably be stuck, packing all the gear while the astronaut's walking. But there are also motor assist devices. You think about the bone loss and the muscle loss. We've also had some external hardware that you can put to give the astronaut strength until theirs come up again when they land on a surface. And that has direct impacts to paraplegics as well, and having them use those assistive devices. We work a great deal on 3D printing right now and thinking about 3D printing materials and taking those to Mars. And because inevitably, we're not going to be able to think of everything or have the mass and volume to take everything that we would like to Mars. And so very often we might just print what we need when we're on Mars. including medications. And one of the experiments and some of the subjects that we're working on is looking at, can we take ingredients and constituents with medications and bring those in and print your amoxil. We're pushing all the boundaries. This is Wake Forest working on 3D printed stem cells and cardiac cells. That sounds pretty cool to be able to 3D print stem cells and cardiac cells. The only thing that would make that cooler is doing that in space. Kate Rubin doing DNA sequencing of cardiac cells in orbit. The ultrasound for carotid intimomedial thickness ultrasound, there are programs that look at the thickness of that intimomedial thickness, which is using a program and algorithm with shades of gray. That was actually developed from JPL software looking at shades of gray from planets. And so another thing that comes from spaceflight. High-focused or high-intensity ultrasound is another thing we're looking at, to take the ultrasound beams from multiple different ultrasounds, and where those sound waves cross creates high-intensity heat. So imagine being able to cauterize a liver or spleen without opening the belly. Another important attribute that we're working on. We've actually done it in pigs successfully already. Vaccine research on space. Bugs act differently and allow us to look at different vaccine targets in space. In fact, salmonella and MRSA have been two areas that we've had particular research in. So that's where we're headed, and why we're going to Mars and then on, at least to the moon in the interim, and then on to Mars. And that's what happens in space physiology. And I don't want to take too much more time because I want you to be able to ask questions of myself and my colleagues. And we'll stop there, Alex.
Perfect.
Come on. Come on up.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Polk. Thank you. That was a fascinating insight into human physiology, adaptive changes in space. Textbooks need to be changed and rewritten, and that'll be a fantastic career for many people. It also makes me reflect on how many of the things that you've discovered in space could be used back here on Earth, and I think that's a lovely translation. So yeah, fantastic. So welcome to our guests at the front, and we've got some microphones roving around the room if there's anybody that would like to ask any questions. So we've got one in the middle here from Rowan.
I can shout out, that helps.
You could, yeah.
The bone loss is very interesting. I just wondered, I was going to start with a fantastic talk. I really, really enjoyed it. I wondered, does the bone loss, I sort of have an identical mimic of immobilization bone loss you'd see down here, and interventions aimed at anabolic, catabolic sides and preserving that bone. Have they been effective in the bone loss you see in space?
So the mechanism for that is identical to immobilization. But the key area here is that we can do better types of mitigation by making sure the person exercises against the forces that are necessary. And so in the space station, we have the appropriate amount of exercise equipment that can pretty much stop the bone and muscle loss from occurring. We do have the potential problem of anybody that does exercise a lot knows that they can get injured from just exercising. So we have to have those other methods that could protect the astronaut in long-duration spaceflight if, in fact, they did get injured, because without gravity, it clearly is a great driver for losing and causing the atrophy of both muscle and bone.
Other questions, if you could have a show of hands if you've got anything you wanted to ask. Question at the front here on the right.
Hi, are there any conditions that spaceflight is a proven risk factor for, like after the astronauts come back to Earth, and if they develop any illnesses or anything?
So I would just say, so I guess the question sounds like it's addressing long-term health.
Yeah.
I can go back and look at and just make reference to the bone discussion we just had. Even though we are mostly preserving bone density, the question is the bone is still remodeling. And so it comes back not looking the same in terms of trabecular versus cortical bone. So, what we do is have a program then by where we monitor the astronauts, their health over their lifetime, even after they've left the agency. So and I'll go back to bone as an example. So yes, we have seen fractures in astronauts who were either even active or even in the management roles after they were flying. And so we've looked at and asked questions like, to answer that question, it doesn't appear that there's any increased risk from that, but we're going to continue to monitor over the decades. And then in the bigger picture, yeah, we do have a program whereby we surveil the astronauts, their health, and it's voluntary, but even after they leave the agency, they can come back once a year, and we screen them and do an evaluation and see where they are from a health standpoint. So are we finding much right now that we can point to and say this is an increased risk from spaceflight? I would say not yet. There's nothing that really jumps out yet, but we're still early in this process, and it's only recently that we've actually had a big bump up in the number of people that have flown and have flown for a long time.
So. Just add a couple things.
Yep, absolutely.
I tell my children that the radiation we soak up gives us superpowers, and they don't buy that necessarily, but when you actually look, we tend to outlive a normative population base. Now, that's a selection filter based on who we are, but whatever effects there may be don't seem to be too detrimental to long-term function.
So that's a good thing.
Yep.
But this is all based upon short-duration spaceflight. Even on the International Space Station, we have excellent data now that says that it's not a health hazard, basically, to have been there and then come back to Earth. But for the long term, we still have to ask those questions because, for example, with the osteoporosis occurring, what you're really changing is the trabecular area, so red blood cells, white blood cell home, where they're made. Maybe we're changing that, and we're decreasing the amount of blood cells that can be made in the future. With long-duration space travel and the potential of lots of radiation over a long period of time, would we do something like increasing Alzheimer type of demeditation in people? We don't know this at all. When you go into space, lots of parts of your body changes. So the heart is globular here on Earth because of gravity pulling it down. When you go up into space, it balls up. And could you have remodeling of the heart so that if you came back to Earth after an extremely long time on Mars or elsewhere or in deep space, that you no longer had that same function, and so you would have the potential of early heart failure? It's a wonderful set of questions for people to look at in the future.
So I was interested in the sort of neurocognitive, neuropsychiatric changes that you may observe acutely in the early phases of being in space, and whether or not you are exploring the long-term consequences of prolonged space exposure on the, if you like, again, on that neurocognitive function as you anticipate journeys to Mars and elsewhere, and whether that is screened out based on your selection process or whether it's...
Not totally.
Yeah.
So we actually did discuss that a bit. I'll try to summarize a lot of it. We have looked very keenly for neurocognitive changes, deficits, if you will. And you're doing it in a background where a lot is expected of the individual. And it's not just rote memory or reproducing or following a checklist. Every day is really a synthesis problem where you have to combine factors that you've never seen before into coherent execution of a payload, for instance. And so by and large, we accomplish these things fairly easily, fairly on time, and at very high volume for extended periods of time. When we have looked deliberately at neurocognitive function, we do not see any deficits. There was a great review by Dietrich Manzi maybe 10 years ago, which again showed no neurocognitive deficits. And we do screening tests on folks. We've actually had to come up with better screening tests because it was easy to defeat these screening tests and learn how to get around them. And actually, our scores got better as we went on. So if there are cognitive deficits, they have to be very, very minor and heavily compensated when you really look at the function. Now, as Dr. Schneider said, this is based on 6-month missions to which, that's our standard tour of duty. And when we go longer, is that still true? Not sure. But in general, that doesn't seem to be a deficit for us right now. And we will continue to surveil that. And I think the long-term surveillance post-career is also important for us.
And agree with everything Dr. Baird said, and I'll just add that with recent authorization by Congress to allow us to do more in terms of care of astronauts following their departure from the agency. We're now going to be doing, as part of that annual exam I mentioned, we'll be doing behavioral health screening as well on evaluation. Whether or not we'll do cognitive testing, I think is still TBD, but we'll certainly be having that contact with them.
And then once again, I'd like to look to the future. So if you're on Mars and you're looking back at Earth, the size of the Earth is the size of this microphone. And if you were out there in the noonday sun and you could sunbathe, you'd only get about 40% of the same sunlight that you would get on Earth at the noonday sun. So, there's can be up to 22 minutes of delay in communication. So if you're talking with your spouse or children at home and you say hello, then 44 minutes later they say hi, Dad, or hi, Mom.
Your question, along with the initial one, really points to that which we are terribly concerned about is not only the health now, but also the health in the future, not just as they retire, but also for crew selection purposes. Trying to take the amount of data that we have available and utilize that to try to predict for the future what is the best crew selection possibilities, what's our best mitigation strategies for that. And you have to realize our N is extremely small. 300 and some have flown in space, and for the U.S. And that N, looking at our future missions with the Moon and Mars, we're not sending like 40 people at a time. You know, it's going to be, again, small crew for with a limited number of missions on an annual basis. So the amount of data that we gather is critical. The information that Dr. Taddeo mentioned as far as new authorization to be able to not only monitor, diagnose, and treat the astronauts after they've retired is very helpful as well, because that's going to then give us that longitudinal information to give and make that database even larger. So the more we can learn, the better we'll be able to predict, but it's going to be difficult anyway.
We had a question top left from... Hi, yeah, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I was just wondering, with the raised intracranial pressure and the orbital nerve swelling, is that worse the longer that they're in space? And also when they return, how long does that take to disappear, or does it disappear at all?
So, no. I was just going to say, I'll start, and then Mike can chime if you want. So, I think I understood the question. Is there an increase? Does the condition worsen over time? There's some indication that perhaps, but for some individuals, it looks like there has been a plateau, at least in the features that we can measure. So I would say ultimately it's to be determined, but I would guess the greater the exposure, the greater the effect that you see. And I think there was another part to your question. I'm blanking on what it was.
And when they return, does that instantly go back to normal, or does it take time, or does it persist?
The answer is yes to all those questions. So for the most part, the conditions do resolve. There are some, for example, like choroidal folds that may persist over time. But for the most part, the condition resolves. And I'll add on to that, if an individual who had findings previously flies again, we will typically see essentially the same thing.
Just one little point is that when you're using the term intracranial pressure, everybody should be thinking number. We don't check intracranial pressure pre-flight or post-flight. We only check a few people post-flight if they meet a certain clinical threshold, and that's typically mapped to optic disc edema. So there's a lot of insight we do have, especially with the end organ effects of this syndrome. There's a lot of insight we do not have.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. The findings are consistent with raised intracranial pressure, but as Mike says, we don't have those readings.
Yep, hello. First of all, as a massive space fan, thank you very much for the fantastic talk this lunchtime and the inspiring work that you do in spaceflight. As an immunologist, the changes in the immune system are absolutely fascinating with long-duration spaceflight, particularly with things like the reactivation of human herpes viruses that occurs coincident with that decrease in immune function. That reactivation appears to increase in frequency over time. So do you think this is going to be a big problem as we increase the duration of spaceflight out to a couple of years?
I can start with that. So there's a constellation of immune changes that happen that have been characterized for a long time. Neutrophil chemotaxis, lymphocyte expression, as was mentioned, delayed onset hypersensitivity, and every immune modulator you can think of, by and large, changes. I can't even remember all of them anymore. There were only 2 when I was in medical school, but there's a lot now. However, when you look at the end effect, the only thing we actually do see is increased viral shedding. And we do not see a deficit of immune function leading to increased infectious disease or really anything beyond that, with a possible exception of a cutaneous reaction we see, which may be an undue reaction to airborne allergens. But in general, we don't see that as a problem per se. Now, these are 6 months to 1 year missions. I'll tell you one anecdotal story. As we were uncovering our immune story in the early 90s, I went to Russia. I was one of the first Americans at a Russian landing, and we asked about immune deficit because the biggest antigenic challenge you'll get is the first few minutes after landing. And we were surrounded by people, the landing crew and the native Kazakhs, who were curious about what was going on. And so literally we had 3-year-olds, we had babies, we had grandmothers, some with productive coughs. I mean, basically all the descendants of Genghis Khan were there to watch this landing. And I asked, do you see an increase in infectious disease post-flight? The answer is no, they never see anything, and that's been our experience as well. So what I think we're seeing is a constellation of adaptive changes in the immune system which may or may not correlate to a clinical outcome. But again, if you don't look, you won't find it. So over protracted periods, that's where our experience base is limited.
Thanks, Dr. Sinclair. Fantastic talk. I'm a massive fan of space exploration as well. In fact, I tried a couple of years ago to become an astronaut candidate and was embarrassingly thrown out of the program in front of television by Chris Hadfield. I've never forgotten him about that. But as a urologist who also does high-altitude climbing, have you ever consulted one of us regarding your intracranial pressure? Because one of the drugs for urology is Viagra. I'm sure half of the audience must have taken it. It's a tablet which was originally discovered for pulmonary hypertension, but has a very interesting side effect, as you well know. And have you ever considered doing a clinical trial up in space? And if you are, I'm willing to volunteer.
First, let me crush your dreams. No. We've looked at the drugs that are used in mountain climbing. In fact, we've had a great discussion with Alex and her team this morning about the difficulties in the pharmacologic impacts. Nothing is simple in spaceflight. For an example would be Diamox, which is used quite frequently in high-altitude mountain climbers for the increase in cerebral edema that they might have, or pulmonary edema. And Diamox in spaceflight lowers both the intracranial pressure but also the intraocular pressure. And if you lower one more than the other, you can get what's called hypotony, where the choroidal folds actually get worse because the intraocular pressure is kind of pushing against the choroid to prevent those folds, and now you've lowered the intraocular pressure and the folds get worse. In addition, the Diamox increases calcium through the kidneys, and I've already got calcium through the kidneys, and so an astronaut who I might lower his ICP or her ICP a little bit, and then I give them a kidney stone, would probably not be grateful to me. But we have looked at those, and that's the difficulty with the spaceflight physiology, is some of the answers that are used on the ground, and especially in the high altitude environments, submarine environments, or other environments of extreme environments that we use as analogs, are not comparative or not able to be used in spaceflight with the same assurity due to the changes in space physiology.
Well, I'd like to get to the point. Yes, there is successful sex in space. And the way that works is we have grown snails and Medaka fish through their whole life cycles, and they've done really well.
Glad we didn't go
for it. This will be the last time you see Dr. Snyder on the trip with us at NASA.
Hi, thank you. I'm a medical physicist, so I'm having a bit of a fangirl moment here. My best friend was born during the first Apollo moon landings, and boy, does she not let us forget it. And as you know, she'll be 50 this year. When should the young women here aim to get pregnant to have a baby during the Artemis moon landing?
Go ahead. Yeah, well, we're hoping to have the first woman land on the moon in 2024 at the South Pole of space. And in fact, we were supposed to have a couple of women with us here today. I don't want you to think that we're monopolizing it but Dr. Fogarty, who's our chief scientist at Johnson Space Center, unfortunately had another event come up that she had to attend. So we unfortunately have a rather large male presence on this one right now, but we are, you know, the one thing that I think is really important is to increase the amount of women in STEM and women in spaceflight in general. And I think we're pushing those bounds and doing that as much as we can, but have more to go. And you know, with the two astronauts we have on orbit right now, Anne and Nikki are both outstanding. You know, Christina rather, Koch and Anne are phenomenal astronauts. And you know, they've been asking us to think about, you know, when are we going to announce or select? Will it be a new selection or will it be out of the current cadre for who the first woman to walk on the moon will be? And so you'll know who that is probably within the next 1.5 to 2 years. Tell her to hold out for that so that she can get a poster for that.
But I would also say that Artemis is one thing that we're doing, right. But what Dr. Polk showed you is there's multiple spacecraft being built. There has never been a time in history like now where so many human-carrying spacecraft were being built, not just thought about, not just PowerPoints, but these are spacecraft that are going to carry people to low Earth orbit. And we're not the only game in town. India is building a human-rated spacecraft. Russia has been flying one for quite a while. They have a new generation spacecraft on the books. So the amount of human spaceflight in general is going to expand, and we expect those opportunities to be really widely available to a lot more people than they used to be.
And I would add, as you saw Dr. Polk's presentation, it wasn't just about taking people, but there's a whole lot of robotic activity that's going on as well. And so we get these questions about, you know, we hear all about STEM. And STEM is not just all about how you're going to be the astronaut on the space vehicle. I'm going to shamelessly plug something going on here. I just got back from Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in California earlier this week, and they're mentioning to us we got to see the Mars 2020 rover being built. And I bring that because we have young people in the audience. Every rover that has been built by NASA has been named by children. And the way that takes place is that there's a competition that goes on. And the competition for the Mars Curiosity rover was won by a young girl living out in the middle of Iowa, had actually moved with her family from China to the United States. She, in order to win that competition, you have to write, not only get the name, but also what you think is write a small thesis, if you will, a paper, about why it should have that name. This young lady won that with the name Curiosity and was treated to coming to the launch of that spacecraft, watching it when it actually touched down on the Martian surface. She is now a senior at Yale University and is going to be working in the area of bioelectronics. So there's a lot of activity for young people, not necessarily just to go to that surface.
You mentioned there that there's the Indian space race, there's the Russians, there's the Chinese, there's a whole global enterprise now in human space travel. How interactive and integrated are you to these other communities such that you can gather all the data in an open access way as opposed to closing yourselves off?
Let me start with that. First of all, I didn't say space race.
Sorry.
And that's key because there's two big revolutions that have happened in spaceflight during the last couple of decades. And the biggest one is internationalization. So what used to be two Cold War adversaries, the US and the USSR, have been working in space together since the early 90s, to the point where now we can't imagine not working together on big projects. The International Station has 5 partner agencies, 25 plus countries, and every day that is run by mission control centers who have to talk to one another across cultural, language, philosophical boundaries, and we do this. That is how we operate ISS. That is our new norm in space. In fact, there are kids in college now who are born of US and Russian engineers and European and whatnot who met each other in the early 90s during this. So we have a new generation of people who can't remember a time when we didn't work internationally like this. So that's huge. Now, for the non-ISS partners per se, India, they are trying to develop an independent capability to fly 3 Indian people on an Indian spacecraft by 2022. So we are collaborative with them, certainly. We're not partnering with them, but we're helping them develop their indigenous technology, which will then give them something more to bring to the table for large international projects. So it is a very international world right now.
I think it'll also expand beyond governments, and we're seeing that now on the commercial side, where on that lunar program for Artemis, there's ESA, who's built a service module. The U.S., there are contractors that are going to be vying and other countries that are going to be vying for the different modules to build those for Gateway and for the lander. And I think that'll amplify as we go further in space. When we go to Mars, it'll be even more multiple countries and multiple commercial folks. I'm kind of envisioning kind of like the race cars are at Indy and Daytona, where they have all those stickers on them. I'm waiting for a spacecraft that has the left Twix and right Twix on either side of the engines. But it's becoming no longer the domain of strictly governments or the Cold Warriors. It's really changing dramatically.
It may be worth noting that the station is bilingual. Every crew member who flies has to be proficient in English and Russian. And so if you grew up speaking French, you still have to learn English and Russian and operate in those languages.
Thank you. I'm going to pull the meeting to a close and just say thank you so much for answering our questions and for coming today to visit us at the University of Birmingham and University Hospital Birmingham. Thank you so much.